again, my friends, and welcome once more to the Invisible College. I'm sorry I haven't been making a lot of videos lately. I've been working very hard on developing the new system for the college itself. And this is going to come into operation within the next week, I reckon. Certainly the beginnings of it anyway. And it's going to make it much more accessible for people to find previous videos that I've done, and also various newsletters and so on I've also published. We're going to be moving into the next year, and I'm very excited about this. But I haven't forgotten you, and I've got a great lecture for you today. It's called Mystery of the Fleur de Lys. Let's put it up here. This is part one. It goes into the whole 100 Years' War. Now, if you're anything like me and you're a bit of a history buff, you've heard about the 100 Years' War, but even if you aren't into history, you maybe know Shakespeare, and you've heard of Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt, and once more under the breach, dear friends, once more. All that. That's all part of the 100 Years' War, which was a war that went on for generations between England and France. So we're going to look at that and what that was really all about, which was actually nothing to do with a war between the English and the French as such. It was really a family affair. But you'll understand what I'm saying when we go into this further. The English were caught up with this, and so were the French, obviously. But it was really a fratricidal family affair that brought that about. But we're going to go into all that in the course of this lecture. So stay with me. I think you'll enjoy this one. So, the Mystery of the Fleur de Lys, Part 1, the 100 Years' War. Now, this week, the English, yes, I'm going to start here in England, the English went on their biggest political march ever to demand change. Sensible estimates put the crowd at over 1 million people. The media tried to talk it down and say it was only 110,000. But when you see aerial pictures, these crowds stretching back after street, on road after road, going way back, not just in the immediate vicinity of Parliament. It must have been at least 1 million. Anyway, it was by far the biggest. It was far bigger than the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by Wat Tyler. You may have heard of that if you know anything about history. Or Jack Cade's rebellion of 1450, when he struck the London Stone. The defiant people of Kent came out demanding change. This is much bigger than anything like that. And it's clearly ordinary Englishmen and women have had enough of having their concerns ignored. They're demanding that their voices be heard. So this is the crucible that we are in at the moment. The Parliament is not listening to the people. The government's not listening to the people. The people come out on the streets demanding change. Now, that's not an unusual thing in France, is it? And in response to the Raising the Colours protests in England, the French too have recently been out on the streets again. Well, they're always out on the streets, yellow vest protests or whatever. But they do this under the Tricolore, the three-coloured flag of France. So they're waving their tricolour flags in patriotic fury against both the regime in Paris and the EU in Brussels. And the French have a long tradition of revolution going back to 1789, when they deposed and beheaded Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. You all heard of the French Revolution and the beheading of the king and queen. In many respects, that was the birth of the modern world. I see the French Revolution of 1789 as being the first communist revolution, actually. Communism derives its energy and its inspiration from the French Revolution. And that's why communism is always associated with revolution. But that's another story. And in 1830, Eugène Delacroix, he's an artist, painted Liberty Leading the People. That's the figure you see there. It celebrates another revolution. This one was held in July of 1830. And this bloody revolt replaced the Bourbon king Charles X with his cousin Louis Philippe of the House of Orleans. And that's a name we're going to come across again, Orleans. And we seem to have these Charleses and these Philippes going right back through French history. Marianne, who leads the charge, represents liberty. There you can see her top ripped, carrying the flag and leading them over the barricades, these people who were revolting against the Bourbon regime. France has had many revolutions and many different republics. This was just one event among many. But she wears the Phrygian cap of the original French Revolution of 1789 and carries the Tricolore banner of the French Republic. So there she is, scrambling over the barricade, carrying the Tricolore. But is the Tricolore the right flag for the French to be waving now? Arguably, and I'm going to make this argument in future lectures, this is a little series we're going to be doing here. This is only the first one in this series. Arguably, there is an older, more mystical flag that represents the true spiritual heart of France, the Fleur de Lys, or flower of light. That's what it means. And in this series, we're going to explore the meaning of this symbol. We begin with how, in the 100 Years' War, the Fleur de Lys was appropriated by kings of England. And as we will see, the French kings only regained full control over France when they turned to God for help. That's important. And if you're French and you're listening to this, I'd like you to think on what I'm going to be talking about here, because it's very much to do with, I see, the plight of France in the present. That's why I'm doing this. I'm not doing this just as a romp through history. It's the plight of France in the present that concerns me. And I would go further and say that France will only truly be great again when it reclaims its heart as represented by its old flag, the Fleur de Lys. The tricolor of revolution will not save France from a cycle of revolutions and absorption into the globalist empire. Yes, that's what the EU is all about. It's to do with globalism and the idea of getting rid of all borders and having a free-for-all. You go and live wherever you like in the world. And unfortunately, most of the world would much rather live in Europe than in third world countries, which is what's causing huge crises in Europe. You can't do this. If you've got an advanced culture and civilization, you have to protect it. You have to if you've got a lovely garden, a lovely walled garden, you don't throw open the gates and let anyone come in there and trample it and pick the flowers and take everything from it, do you? You protect it. And that is how we should be viewing the countries of Europe. Anyway, pressing on. But the Fleur de Lys, if properly understood, just might give back France its heart. That's why I'm doing these lectures. In this episode, I want to talk about this flag in the context of a family struggle that took place between 1337 and 1453. So it's actually longer than 100 years, isn't it? Quite a bit longer, more like 116 or something, I think. I say a family struggle because the Plantagenet kings of England were not really English, but in origins they were Norman French. They spoke French right up until about the time of Edward III. they regarded themselves as French. England was an outpost of their empire. So England was for hundreds of years part of the Norman French Empire. And we in England forget that. We think of England as being the dominant party. It wasn't. It was just part of the Angevin Empire coming from France. William the Conqueror, we've all heard of William the Conqueror. He was Duke of Normandy, a province in France, before he conquered England. And his shield bore two lions. That's his shield, the shield of Normandy. And they represented Normandy itself and Maine, the two parts of his dukedom, you could say, of Normandy and Maine. Maine was a province south of Normandy and east of Brittany. So there's another part of France. So he had two lions on his shield. Richard I of England, popularly known as Lionheart, Coeur de Lion, added a third lion to his shield in 1198. This was from his mother's arms and represented Aquitaine. Aquitaine, another part of France. Although England was by far the most important possession of the Plantagenet kings, Richard only visited it once as king. For most of his life, he was either living in France, on crusade, or being held hostage in Germany. Thus, the three lions of England are really symbols of the Norman Empire. In origin, they are French. That's a bit of a shock. Shock to me as an Englishman that our three lions actually come from France. Anyway, I'm going to show you a bit more about that. Here we can see it. Henry II, you've heard of the Lion in Winter, Henry II, very powerful king. And he married a lady called Eleanor of Aquitaine. We're going to talk a bit more about her in due course. So the three lions of England began as symbols of France, of regions of France. And they later became representative of England. So they had actually three sons. I've left off the eldest son because he died before his father. So when Henry II died, Richard I came onto the throne, Richard the Lionheart. And when he died, his brother John became king. So our successive kings and queens descend from John. They don't descend from Richard. This is a bit of a worry in itself, I think. He's not a very good king, John. Anyway, so Eleanor had one lion, and they put that on the shield as well, and they got three lions. At root, the 100 Years' War between France and England was a family matter. It was a quarrel over who should rule the western half of France, the House of Plantagenet or the House of Valois. It can be regarded as a French civil war, with the English supplying soldiers to fight one side of the battle. That's a different way of looking at it, isn't it? Once more under the breach, dear friends. This is the Plantagenet inheritance. Henry I, King of England, was Duke of Normandy, and he had a daughter called Empress Matilda, who was first married to the Holy Roman Empire, Henry V, and later to a duke called Count Geoffrey of Anjou, another province in France. And they had a son called Henry, who became Henry II of England. Henry married Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, who had earlier been married to Louis VII, King of France. So you can see how this is all very, very French when you go into it. There's not much English happening around here at this time. So when Henry II became King of England in 1154, he was already Count of Anjou and Duke of Aquitaine. So he's got extensive holdings in France, and we're going to look at those. And here you can see Henry's lands in France, coupled with those of his wife Eleanor, comprise more than half of the country. So those red and lighter reds or darker reds, those are all the lands under Henry's lordship. But the fly in the ointment was that Henry was required to swear fealty to the King of France for his French lands. And let me explain this to you a little bit. I'm just going to come out of here for a moment. Yeah. In medieval times, you had what's called feudalism. And with feudalism, the country is actually owned by the king or queen, usually the king. And then he doles out bits of it to his different nobles, his aristocracy, and gives them dukedoms or earldoms or marshes or whatever level they're at, viscounts. And they then they have to swear fealty to the king. They have to go on their knees to the king, and they take an oath to serve him, that they're his men. So it's a kind of mafia situation. The mafia boss is the king. He can't go out and farm the land himself. He needs people to do that for him, and he needs people to control it for him. So he appoints the people that he likes, his friends, or at least the people who are beholden to him and going to look after his interests, he thinks. And they then administer parts of that country, and they're going to have knights and barons underneath them, and under them will be peasants who are going to do the actual farming work. The peasants give half of their crop to the lord of the manor, and he gives part of it, what he gets, up to his boss, who's going to be maybe a baron or maybe a duke or something, and then he has to give part of that to the king. So it's a kind of pyramid scheme. So the poor old peasants are doing the work, and in those days, you got wealth from the land. You didn't get wealth from trading. Very few people were making much money out of trading. It was mainly an agricultural society we were dealing with. So obviously, the more land you had, the more income you had. And the king's going to get his cut if you have to swear fealty to him. And that's what the Plantagenets didn't like about their situation in France. There they are, they got more than half of the country under their jurisdiction. And the king of France is relatively weak compared with them. And yet they've got to go on bended knee to him for the lands that they, I'm going to say own, but they are in charge of in France. And they didn't like that. They wanted to be kings themselves, or at least of the part that they controlled. And that's the real cause of the 100 Years' War. It's nothing to do with England. It's to do with France. So the fly in the ointment was that Henry was required to swear fealty to the King of France. And Henry's third son was the notorious King John. Yeah, I mentioned John. He lost his baggage train in the wash, along with his crown, I think. His crown jewels in the wash, running away. And he died shortly after. A disastrous war with the France in his reign led to the loss of nearly all of the Angevin, that's the lands belonging to the Plantagenets, the lands in France, except for Gascony. So you can see before 1180, most of France under their control. After, in 1223, only this tiny corner down here in Gascony is still under British or English control, or I say English, Plantagenet control. And the kings of France, whose symbol is the Fleur de Lys, they're controlling nearly all of France by that time. So King Philip IV of France, this is around this time, was crowned at Rheims on the 6th of January 1286. And there you can see him in his finery. Interesting, he's sitting on a lion throne, and he's got all the Fleur de Lys on his gown. And he's most famous for dissolving the order of the Knights Templar. And I'm sure many of you watching this are all too familiar about the suppression of the order of the Knights Templar. and how shocking that was, and Jacques de Molay being the last Grand Master, being burnt at the stake, and all of that. And well, this was the king who did it, and he prompted the Pope, who was in Avignon at that time, to pass a decree outlawing the Templars and giving the king the right to suppress the order. He had to get the Pope on his side first. And that meant he would get their money, but their money disappeared. Nobody knows where it went. So it's a bit of a fool's errand, really. But anyway, he suppressed the order, and it was also suppressed in England by Edward II. But Edward was not as harsh as Philip was. And most of the knights were able to just slip away and join other orders or go abroad or whatever. So it wasn't the same thing in England. Now, I'm going to show you a bit about how these dynasties link together. This family tree here, you can see. You have Philip III, who's from 1245 to 1285, and he ruled 1270 to 1285. So there he is, and his eldest son is this Philip IV we were just talking about, who suppressed the Templars. And Philip IV had 3 sons. Great, isn't it? 3 sons. You'd think the monarchy would be really secure with that. You've got Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV. Now, you might notice that each of these are kings in turn, and that's because they didn't have children. For some reason, they weren't having children. And so then the next in line is Isabella of France, the daughter, and she married Edward II. Now, at the time they got married, all these brothers were still alive. Nobody thought for a minute that she's going to be in line for the throne. But there it is. Starkly, she's married Edward II, and they have a son called Edward III. Now, I'm going to talk a bit more about them before I go into what happens next. So, Philip IV married Joan I, the Queen of Navarre, on the 12th of August, 1284. And his shield was impaled with the arms of Navarre. So you can see the arms of Navarre there, this curious arrangement with, I don't know what it's meant to represent, a sort of cobweb. Anyway, his shield was impaled with the arms of Navarre. And the field of Fleur de Lys was the arms of France. So he's got the 2 sides, his wife's side and his side. Makes sense. And Philip had 3 sons, each of whom became King of France. Well, I just said all that, but they all died without heirs. His sole surviving daughter was Isabella. And taking after her father, he's called Philip the Bell because he was very handsome, and she was a beauty, but also like him, steely and ambitious. Her nickname was the She-Wolf, or She-Wolf of France. And there she is. Actually, she does look quite hot, doesn't she? In that picture anyway. But she was not a very nice person at all, as you'll discover. So in 1308, Isabella married King Edward II of England, and he was the son of Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. Edward I, very tough king. You've seen him in Braveheart, I'm sure. Edward I was the one who conquered North Wales and built castles all over it, and brought the Welsh under his rule. And his son Edward II was completely different. He was a different temperament entirely. Edward II was genial but lazy. He preferred fishing to warfare and was viewed as weak. And he was also rumoured to be gay, on account of his close relations with his favourites. First Piers Gaveston, a handsome knight in his court, and excited great jealousy among the nobility, and they later murdered him. And later Hugh le Despencer the Younger, who also came to a sticky end. He was to come to Edward II was to come to a grisly end, but his marriage to Isabella introduced the French arms of the Fleur de Lys onto the shields of subsequent English kings. Now we're going to have a look at that. So by that time, the arms of Edward II, King of England, but really descended from the Plantagenets and French. The simple three lines of England, really of Normandy with Aquitaine, were his inherited arms from Edward I. And the top half of Isabella's shield showed the arms of England impaled with those of France, the Fleur de Lys. The bottom half were her own as Queen of Navarre. I'm not sure what the blue bit with the white band is. I think that's a sub-kingdom of Navarre. I'm not sure what that is, but you couldn't see Navarre with that strange kind of cobwebby thing. In 1227, Edward II was deposed by Roger Mortimer, the Earl of March, who was by then Isabella's lover. I told you she was beautiful, and people noticed, and Edward, well, everyone regarded him as being gay. He managed to have a son by her, but who knows? Anyway, Roger Mortimer, who was the Queen's lover, and together they plotted and they overthrew Edward and put him in jail. Edward was taken prisoner and held in appalling conditions at Berkeley Castle. There he died on the 21st of September, 1327. And it was rumoured at the time that he was murdered by having a red-hot poker pushed up his anus. Ouch. While he was held down screaming on the table. That was supposedly, these again are the rumours of the time, as punishment for his homosexuality, which was regarded as totally abhorrent. So they put a red-hot poker up there. And Isabella would rule as regent in the name of her son for the next 3 years. So there we are. We have got Mortimer and Isabella on the throne. And Mortimer acted like he was king himself, using the situation to appropriate lands and titles. And this did not go down well with his fellow barons, you can bet it didn't. As long as Isabella's son, another Edward, was too young to take the throne, he, that's Mortimer, and Isabella were his guardians. So they were guardians over young Edward, Prince Edward, and therefore able to get away with treason. Yeah, of course, overthrowing the king and putting him in a jail and, probably ordering his murder is treason of the first order. And it seems like Roger Mortimer had ideas that he was going to be king. And actually Edward, the son, who was Prince of Wales, of course, was terrified that he was going to get the same treatment. And actually his mother didn't want that to happen either. And I think he was sent over to France. I'm not sure about that, but I think that's true, to keep him out of harm's way. Anyway, the son grew up to be Edward III, arguably the greatest of the Plantagenet kings. And the situation in France may have remained acceptable to the English king except for two factors. First of all, while his mother had 3 older brothers who each became in turn King of France, none of them produced heirs. The throne might have been expected to pass to Edward III, who was heir on his mother's side. Yeah, he was a grandson of the last King of France, direct grandson. But instead it went to a cousin, Philip VI. And we can see that on this chart here. So we got the 3 uncles who've all died without children. We got his mum there, married to Edward II. And then we got Edward III here. And we got going back a generation, Philip IV, suppressor of the Templars, had a brother who was Charles of Valois. I think he might have been Duke of Orleans. I'm not sure about that. You can look it up if you're interested. Anyway, he had a son who became, the French crowned him as Philip VI. So that was outrageous to Edward III, who was, his mother should have inherited, in his opinion, and she's been passed over. Well, that sort of thing happens in dynasties, especially in those days when they didn't really like putting a woman on the throne. We saw this with Matilda and Stephen. Stephen was a cousin, and he took over as king. And it took a lot for Henry II to get the throne back from Stephen and restore it to that line. So this is a repeating act in this French-English dynasty. The French side is now being reinforced by the marriage to Isabella, and he's now got the Fleur de Lys on his shield, and he decided to do something about it. So the coronation of Philip VI was an assertion of male primogeniture. It was the start of a new French dynasty, the Valois taking over from the Capetian dynasty. So this is where we get the name Valois from this line. And Philip VI was popular in France and might have gone unchallenged in England had he not acted recklessly. Yeah, it's his own fault. He should have let lions lie. Those 3 lions are by now becoming very English. He should have let them lie. But in 1337, he declared that Edward had forfeited Aquitaine for harbouring an enemy of his, Robert III of Artois. That's another part of France. And Philip's subsequent seizure of Aquitaine and Poitou, the last remaining parts of the Angevin Empire, was tantamount to a declaration of war. So there he is. This last little bit of France that England's hung on to in Aquitaine, he's now grabbed it and said, no, you're not going to have that anymore. You've supported my enemy, Robert III, you've given him sanctuary. You're dispossessed. I'm king, I do what I say. Well, he probably thought he'd get away with it, but not with Edward. So we've done that. So Edward III brought in many changes, and this is in England. He was the first of the Plantagenet kings to make English, as opposed to French, the official language of the realm. He also created the Order of the Garter, in quasi-imitation of both the fabled Round Table of King Arthur and the Knights Templar, which his father, on command from the Pope, had disbanded in England. So this is 30 years after the destruction of the Templar Order. Edward III re-establishes a new order under his control called the Knights of the Garter, which is a sort of quasi-Arthurian round table. King Arthur was, the tales of King Arthur are very popular in both in Britain and in France at that time. So to have his own order, and he had a round tower in Windsor Castle where they can hold their meetings at a round table. They built a special chapel at Windsor for the Knights of the Garter, the St. George's Chapel. And he changed the patron saint of England from the peaceful Edward the Confessor to the dragon-slaying St. George. So he's sort of quite militaristic. He's thinking in terms of orders of knighthood and chivalry, the loyal knights in his band, as it were. The best knights in the land could be in his order. And they're going to be like St. George. They're going to slay dragons. They're going to deal out law and order. They're going to enforce his demands. So he's got all that going. And Edward was determined to get back his lost territories in Aquitaine. He decided that the best way to do this was to press forward his claims to the throne of France itself. And this claim is shown in his arms, which impaled the Fleur de Lys of France with the lions of England. So this is the first time people had done that, this first king to do this, and the 100 Years' War had begun. Now the English got off to a good start in 1340 by winning a sea battle at Sluis, which is in Flanders, or I think we now call that part of Belgium. And the longbow was the decisive weapon in this engagement, and victory gave Edward control of the English Channel. And that's very important if you go to invade France. You need to have control of the Channel. Just as if you're going to invade England from France, you also need control of the English Channel, at least for long enough to get your army across. So he's established that with this first sea battle. And the longbow is what enabled them to win. Sluis paved the way for the first large land battle in 1346 at Crécy in northern France, which Crécy is south of Calais. The English army was led by Edward III himself, who positioned his archers for full effect. And this was devastating for the French nobility, who were unused to the power of the longbow in the hands of well-trained and practiced archers. I should say here that there was a law in England at the time that adult men had to practice the longbow every week. You know, they had to go out, I think on a Sunday, to practice the longbow. This is sort of around the time of Robin Hood. Oh, he was a bit earlier than this. But, you know, he wanted to have an army where the peasants, the peons, the pawns, were not just, you know, carrying pitchforks and axes or whatever they can pick up in the farm, but would be archers, and good archers with strong arms. You know, you needed to practice to strengthen up your arms to pull these longbows. To even draw back a longbow took a lot of strength. So it was a bit like doing weight training every week to develop his archers to have the strength and training to use the longbow as opposed to the crossbow. And one reason for that was you could fire arrows much more quickly using a longbow than if you had a crossbow. You can get a powerful crossbow, but you'd have to wind that up, and it takes time to do that. But, you know, if you want a powerful bow that can fire quickly, you need a longbow. The eldest son, so he's won the Battle of Crécy. The eldest son of Edward III was another Edward. He's known as the Black Prince. He's the Prince of Wales, of course. And in 1355, he led a large-scale raiding party called a chevauchée into southern France. What they did in a chevauchée is they rode across, burning the crops and destroying villages and killing people and, you know, causing havoc and looting, really as a way to provoke a response from your rivals. They couldn't, you know, are they going to let you get away with that? So his Anglo-Gascon army burned and looted its way through southern France, sacking the cities of Carcassonne and Narbonne down in southeast France. And the French force, led by King John himself, assembled to oppose the Black Prince and his marauders. Well, you know, the king has a duty to the French people to do that. He's got to go and do something about this. And this led to a second great battle of the war at Poitiers in 1356. And in many respects, Poitiers was a repeat of what happened at Crécy. Again, the English and Welsh archers decimated the French nobility. The French were used to fighting as knights on horseback, but their armour proved no protection against arrows fired from longbows. And in this battle, King John of France and his son were captured by the English. So even the king himself was captured. And King John was taken to London and eventually ransomed for a very large sum. Meanwhile, further raids were undertaken by the Black Prince, who was appointed ruler of Gascony by his father. So he's taken over that southwest part of France. And in 1360, a treaty was signed between England and France. Large areas of western France were ceded to Edward III to be administered by the Black Prince. It was not as extensive as the Angevin Empire, but this time sovereignty rested with the King of England, and it seemed to be the end of the war. So the English had got back some of the lands they lost, or I should say this Anglo-French dynasty had got back some of those lands in Aquitaine, which had belonged to Eleanor of Aquitaine long ago, but France was still mostly in the hands of the French. The Black Prince's rule in parts of Gascony and Navarre was not unchallenged. However, there were various rebellions and things there. However, in 1376, he died unexpectedly. Thus, Edward III, who died the following year in 1377, outlived him. So Edward III was planning for his eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, to be the next king, and he was a tough soldier, hardened, trained, he'd won battles. He was going to be the one to push it forwards, but he went and died. And then there was a disaster. The death of the Black Prince was a disaster for the English cause in France and would eventually lead to the fratricidal civil war we know today as the Wars of the Roses. Now, I'm not going to go into those here. They came after the 100 Years' War, but they're very much caused by this event more than anything else. More immediately, in 1377, Edward III was succeeded by Richard II, the son of the Black Prince. So they had to skip a generation because the Black Prince has died, and you've now got Richard II on the throne. And Richard II was only 10 years old when he became king. A very religious man, he idolized St. Edward the Confessor, who he regarded as his personal protector. In honor of the Confessor, he impaled the quartered arms of England and France with those attributed to Edward the Confessor. So the arms of England and France are quartered on one side of the shield and Edward the Confessor on the other, which is a bit odd because he's put the Edward Confessor arms on the wife's side. He's sort of married to Edward the Confessor. It's a bit weird if you think about it. Richard II was married. He married twice, actually, but he wasn't gay. But he had this devotion to Edward the Confessor. So those are the arms. We've got a golden cross with 5 birds. They call them martlets, and they are in gold, and the background is blue. Richard, who in many ways resembled Edward the Confessor, was entirely the wrong person to manage England or the part of France over which he now ruled. Weak and vacillating, he could also be autocratic, believing in his divine right to rule as he saw fit. This led to Richard's deposition in 1399, and he was replaced by his more popular cousin, Henry of Bolingbroke, who was crowned Henry IV. So that's another insurrection that's carried out by a cousin. Very dangerous having cousins in those days, it would seem. And he took over as Henry IV. And during the reign of Henry IV, England and France were largely concerned with internal problems and conflict, and so the status quo remained more or less unchanged. Nevertheless, the French Fleur de Lys remained quartered with the arms of England on Henry's shield. The Plantagenet claim to the throne of France though not being actively pushed, was still there. Actually, Henry IV spent some time in exile in France. I think he was in Brittany before he was able to lead an army with French troops to help him to depose Richard II. So this was all changed when the son of Henry IV took the throne as Henry V. You've all heard of Henry V, I'm sure. Henry V came onto the throne in 1413. Having put down the Owen Glendower rebellion in Wales, Owen Glendower, that was a big event in Wales. But Henry V put it down, and he was already an experienced soldier and general. He was also popular with the people, even the Welsh, who admired his prowess and loyalty to his troops. In fact, at the forthcoming battle we'll talk about shortly, his life was saved by certain Welshmen. Henry resurrected the war with the French started by his great-grandfather, Edward III. In 1415, that's 2 years after he became king, he took an army to France, laying siege to and eventually taking the port town of Harfleur in Normandy. He's crossed over to Normandy. The English, having taken much booty, they looted Harfleur, probably a few other places as well, sought to retreat to Calais. So he's doing a chevauchée, or whatever they call it. He's gone over there, a raiding party really, a bit like a Viking. Got his booty, and then now they want to get back to England with the booty. So he sought to retreat to Calais and hence home. However, they were pursued by a much larger French army. They were trapped on the wrong side of the river, I think. So they couldn't easily get back to Calais. The two armies met on the field of Agincourt, and once more the French army proved to be no match for English and Welsh archers. So again, there was a massive cull of French nobility. They all got bogged down in the mud as well. Securing victory, Henry signed a peace treaty with the French king, Charles VI. I should add, in the Battle of Agincourt, Henry did something which would be considered a war crime today. They had captured a large number of nobility and imprisoned them in a barn. But he decided that he couldn't trust these people's word not to rejoin the battle, and he needed his men to be free to fight and not acting as jailers. So they set fire to the barn and killed them all. I mean, it's shocking. And that caused outrage at the time, that he should do such a thing. And normal practice was that you captured nobility and then you sold them back, you ransomed them, and you made some money out of it. You didn't do something so ignoble as to kill them. So anyway, securing victory, Henry signed a peace treaty with the French king, Charles VI. In it, Henry was named as his heir to the throne of France, and he also married the king's daughter, Catherine. So, we have the marriage of Henry to Catherine, Henry V, was the high point of English ambitions in France. Henry V had ambitions to lead a joint crusade, France and Britain together, to reclaim the Holy Land. But it was not to be. He died in August 1422 at the age of 35. I think that was karma for, burning all those people in the barn. I think it was his karma. Maybe England's karma. Anyway, he left behind as his heir a baby son, later crowned as Henry VI, and a huge problem for the English, how to enforce the terms of the treaty. So the king, Charles VI has signed that treaty and said that Henry or his heirs should inherit the throne of France. But when England's in a bad state, they've only got a baby as their king, what are you going to do? You're going to go do that, or you're going to do the usual thing, go for the cousin. And that's exactly what the French did. So if you are English and you know something of history and memory, the memory is of three great victories by these three leaders: Edward III, the Black Prince, and Henry V. Edward III, Crécy, 1346. The Black Prince, Poitiers, was it 13 something or other? And Henry V, Agincourt, 1415. So you know all these dates. Well, I've forgotten the middle one. But that's not what the war was all about. We didn't win it. We may have won those battles and the Welsh archers and all of that, won someone onto the breach, but we didn't win the war. Far from it. It went bad after that. In reality, the English lost the 100 Years' War. Though the arms of France were still included on the royal standard, right up till 1801, during the reign of the time of George III, who reigned from 1760 to 1820, in reality, the claim to the throne of France was a fiction. In 1801, George renounced all claims to the throne of France and removed the Fleur de Lys from the royal standard. Actually, he may as well have done that, because by that time the French had had their revolution in 1789, and they had dispensed with the Fleur de Lys themselves. They had now had the Tricolore as their flag. So this Fleur de Lys became a relic, and George could just as well renounce it because it didn't mean anything at all by then. The change of fortune in the fortunes of France was due to a number of factors, not least the development of field artillery. Yeah, they did have guns in those days, and armour that could withstand arrows fired from longbows. I think this was particularly Italian armour. The Italians perfected the development of armour at that time. So they started getting armour that could withstand arrows. So they've now got armour that could withstand the arrows. So the longbow was no longer the decisive weapon, and actually masses of archers were being slaughtered. However, at least as big a factor was a spiritual renaissance in France led by Joan of Arc. A very interesting character, Joan of Arc. And she was a clairvoyant. People say she claimed to be a clairvoyant. I think she was. You know, there are people who are clairvoyants. Plenty of them around now. People who can see ghosts. I met someone who could see ghosts. I met other clairvoyants who would know things that they couldn't possibly know of my past. They couldn't possibly know. I've met others who accurately did foretell things that happened in future. So clairvoyance is a real thing. She claimed to be a clairvoyant, and she claimed to be guided by the Archangel Michael and other saints who appeared to her. So they gave her instructions, and she passed these on to the king and his generals. But she was also very, very brave. She took part in these battles. I don't think she carried she may have carried a sword, but I don't think she was actually killing anyone. She was waving a banner and exhorting the troops, onward, dear friends, to better things. And she got wounded. Anyway, in 1428, she presented herself to Charles VII. Because he remained uncrowned, so he was a dauphin, he was not recognised by the English as King of France. Instead, he was commonly referred to as the Dauphin, a title which was the equivalent to Prince of Wales in England. So in other words, you're there lined up, you're the heir, expected to be the next king, but for now you've got this subtitle of Dauphin. And Charles was impressed by the young woman. Maybe she told him his fortune. Maybe she read his aura. I don't know what she did. But he was impressed. Subsequently, she accompanied the army he sent to relieve Orleans, which was then under siege and partly captured by the English. So Orléans, this major French town or city, wall town on a river, was very, very important strategically. The French needed to hold it to clear the way for being able to advance towards Rheims. Rheims is in northeast France in the Champagne region, nominally under English control at that time. But the French needed to get back through there to get to Rheims. Joan, now wearing full armour for protection against English arrows, arrived to Orléans, which was then close to surrender. So part of the city had been taken, but another part was holding out. So she arrived with a relieving army. They came by water over the river. And her stirring words and conviction that it was her destiny to rescue the French monarchy encouraged the French. And she herself was twice wounded in the battle that ensued. I think she got an arrow in the neck or just above the shoulder, so where it's not protected by armour. And I think she got another one she spiked her foot on some spike on the ground. So she herself was twice wounded in the battle that ensued, but she fulfilled certain prophecies that had been circulating that a woman in armour would save France. So there she is, waving the banner. So she's an earlier version of Marianne we saw earlier, waving the flag, leading the French over the barricades. She's a Marianne figure, if ever there was one, patron saint of France. And actually St. Joan is one of the patron saints of France today. The relief of Orléans opened the way to Rheims, the spiritual heart of France. This is where the kings were always crowned. Joan persuaded a reluctant dauphin to seize the moment and come to Rheims, or Rheims. Both pronunciations are used, the French or the German. On July the 17th, 1429, Charles VII was crowned there, with Joan, now known as the Maid of Orléans, in attendance. So she was in attendance while the king is being crowned. He was very fond of her. And this gave him a legitimacy that hitherto was lacking. It signified that God was on his side. So they cut their way to Rheims. They had to defeat other English garrisons on the way to get there. They'd won the Battle of Orléans and they got through to Rheims. That must be God's will. He sent this young girl to lead them and inspire them, and she's God's, sort of Bernadette figure that can converse with archangels, and God's on their side, and the king has been crowned at Rheims. And this gave him a legitimacy that hitherto was lacking, signified that God was on his side, speaking through this extraordinary young woman. Yeah, she was extraordinary. After leading several other unsuccessful campaigns, Joan was eventually captured by the Burgundians. Now, the Burgundians came from a part of France in the Rhone Valley, and the Duke of Burgundy was not swearing his oaths to the King of France. He was on the side of the English at that time anyway. They were allies of the English and handed her over to them, so that the Burgundians handed her over to the English. And she was put on trial for heresy, blasphemy, which was because she was wearing men's clothes, but what was she to do? Go to battle without armour, and acting upon demonic visions. So they assumed that her clairvoyance, her visions, were coming from the devil. Needless to say, she was found guilty on all charges, and she was burnt at the stake. That's what they did with heretics. If the church could kill you if it was fire that did it, as long as your blood wasn't spilt. And if you got burnt at the stake, your blood wasn't spilt. So that was a get out of jail free card as far as heaven was concerned for you who's doing the burning. It doesn't make sense to me, and it probably doesn't to you, but that's how priests tend to think. And it was 1431, and she was still only 19 years of age, the poor girl. So for a couple of years, she'd been this inspiration to France, and now she was burnt at the stake. The French, they were still inspired by what she had done. They went on to retake all of France except for Calais, which remained in English hands until 1558, when it too fell. That was at the time of Mary I, the daughter of Henry VIII. And she said that forever Calais would be written on her heart. Well, it may have been written on her heart, but it was never English again after that. And St. Joan was declared a saint in 1920, as recently as that, only just over 100 years ago, and is now one of the patron saints of France, I think, along with St. Martin. Who's the other one? It's gone out of my head. Anyway, she's a patron saint of France. But the most important event she engineered was the coronation of Charles VII at Rheims, or Rheims, the French equivalent of Westminster Abbey, as a traditional site for coronations. So the French have been getting crowned at Rheims since the 6th century. So this is a very, very holy, special place. And it's very important. If you wanted to be taken seriously as king, you had to get to Rheims and have yourself crowned. We're going to go into that much more in a future episode. Rheims was, and perhaps still is, the spiritual heart of France. In my opinion, it is. As we will discover in the next episode of this series, Rheims is closely connected with Fleur de Lys as a mystical symbol. It is not for nothing was it that the traditional place for the coronation of French kings. Yeah. Today, France is a republic. Indeed, it is France's 5th republic, after a political reorganization carried out by General de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, on the 4th of October 1958. Needless to say, he was its first president. The present president, Emmanuel Macron, is the 8th to be elected. I think I had a couple sort of sit-in presidents while there was no one there, unelected, but that doesn't count. The flag of the Republic is the Tricolore, inherited from the French Revolution of 1789. However, is this a wise choice? Today, England and France are friends. Well, we are, as much as we possibly can be. But both countries are facing major challenges to do with culture and identity. The English, as we saw at the beginning of this talk, have taken to the streets, raising the colours with the cross of St. George. It is widely felt throughout Britain, and not just in England, that there is a disconnect between the government and the people. The flag of St. George has become synonymous with English cultural values, deemed under threat from mass immigration. And that's not just in England, actually, it's in Wales and Scotland as well, and many Welsh people and Scots and Northern Irish, and indeed there were people from as far away as New Zealand came along to this huge demonstration. It was last Sunday, or was it Saturday? Last weekend anyway. This took place, and I say that estimates vary between 110,000 and 5 million. I think probably 1 million is probably pretty close to the numbers involved. It was absolutely massive, the biggest that's ever happened in England, and it's got the government worried, I think. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France is experiencing similar threats to its Christian culture from the same causes, mass immigration, especially from Islamic countries. In my opinion, the tricolor of the French Revolution is not the true rallying image for defending France's Christian heritage. Perhaps it is time for the French to rediscover their ancient national flag, the Fleur de Lys, a holy and mystic symbol of France itself. And in future episodes in this series, we will discuss the esoteric meaning of this symbol, which represents angelic intervention, the origins of Christianity, and even the rule of law. Although identified with royalty and a discarded ancien régime, it is much older than this. Truly, it symbolizes France's birthright as a nation. Seen in this light, perhaps it is time for the French to rediscover the Fleur de Lys as a holy and mystic symbol of France itself. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little lecture. We're going to go into the Fleur de Lys as a symbol much more deeply in future episodes. I reckon 2 more episodes in this little series. But that covers the 100 Years' War. Now, what I wanted to get across to you is that really that war was it was a French war. It's a French civil war between 2 different houses of the French royal family. And the poor, the English, we were dragged into this. If William the Conqueror had never come to England, it would never have happened. We'd never have had a 100 Years' War. We were never invading France before that. But there you go. That is the origin of all the friction that happened between France and England. It was really down to the Normans. So we're going to do much more on this. Please like this video and share it. Hit the little bell if there's still a bell. I don't think there even is there? And follow the channel. I also have the college, the Invisible College, which you can join through patreon.com. And I'm reorganizing that. It's going to be much slicker than it is now. You're going to have access to all my old videos. There are different tiers in the college, and I'm going to do more advanced lectures for the more advanced tiers. But you'll certainly, even if you don't join the college, if you come to patreon.com/Adrian G. Gilbert, you'll find there a lot of lectures you'll be able to watch much more easily from there than you do here, without even joining the college. If you want to join the college, it's only cost you £5 a month, and for the basic lowest tier, and you'll get a lot more lectures to view that way, and also newsletters. Higher tiers cost a little bit more, but they will be more directed towards self-development, and if you're not interested in that side of things, then the lower tier is probably the one for you. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll speak again. Bye for now.